Good morning. Um, this is an autobiography with the title God's Acre, and I'm playing 3D chess games because it interconnects also with other MP4 discussions, dividing my life into the three areas where I have mainly lived: England, America, and Italy. It's a hypertexted story, and this version will give its images as well as being connected to other versions. So one can think of it as rather a layered story. And I'm going to be ending with it as this image of a library and a garden, which is Academia Bessarion, the memory of what I saw when I was 21 with my first baby in my arms, and which here is in a graveyard like Julian of Norwich's Anchor Hold, is God's Acre, or in Italian, this would be the Campo Santo. The lily here is Lord Leighton's sculpture on Elizabeth Barrett Browning's tomb. For Florence's lily, which is actually the iris, which we have planted everywhere. Beginning with England, I'm using these chapters with the title Stolen to describe the ways in which souls get stolen, families are dysfunctional, and how to overcome also their trauma. These are my parents, and this is the frontispiece of their autobiography with alternating chapters by Glony Bolton and Sybil Bolton. Glony Bolton was from an Anglo-Irish family. His father, an artist, had come to Warwick and married. They were both Quakers on both sides. Of Francis, who was a cash, who had been his art student. And my mother came from Yorkshire, her father from Scotland. This is my father's family. The father, grandfather, an artist who died young when my father was only 7. When he was 5, he is acting as the Druids worship in the Warwick pageant. His mother also participating. And the portrait, which is now with my sister-in-law, has my father and my aunt Eileen with their very lovely mother, whom I never saw. My grandmother died before I was born. But here the family is left orphaned, and she has his photograph posed and sends it to relatives, pleading for their help. Derek, who will become a dean of the Church of Ireland after studying at Cambridge. My Aunt Joyce Bolton, who was an artist and also taught child development in America, and I would come to live with her. My father in his Eton collar, and Auntie Eileen, again an artist, and my grandmother. And then my mother's family, this is Sir James Roberts and Lady Roberts and their daughter Alice. She was rather the black sheep of the family. She ran away, eloped at 18 with my grandfather. My mother eventually bought, after having born in South Africa in a tent and having worked in Canada, she came home to Sussex and bought this cottage, Derby's. And I was, though, born in London, but immediately brought down to the countryside to this lovely rose garden that she had built. We also had a house on Strand on the Green on the Thames River, and that was my first memory of the water ripples reflected on the ceiling. And I was a rather shy child. This is my brother Richard, born after me. And then during the war, I can remember being terrified in Victoria Station, like Paddington Bear with a label. We didn't have labels. All of the other children who were being evacuated from the bombing did. And I was terrified that we would be lost, but actually, we were with my nanny or with my father. And during one bombing raid, he took us down to the basement because it was dangerous and had us be photographed in these poly photos where they took 100 shots of us. And then you could have the best one developed. And myself and my brother in 1943. They found for us first Nanny Berslin, who was half Russian, half German, and we would speak Russian together, which I don't remember, except I could still remember the sounds. And then my father found us the family of the Beatties, Mrs. Beattie and Mr. Beattie. He was a carpenter. They were from Scotland, living in Sussex. And here we are with them, uh, where we stayed until after the end of the war, when we were suddenly abruptly taken from them because they thought Mrs. Beattie had TB. It was actually lung cancer. And we only saw her once again, and we were always running away to try to be back with her. This is what was like in Hastings at the Declaration of Peace, VE Day. And I can remember all of the bunting, the flags, and I kept drawing pictures about it. England has a terrible class problem, and I was grateful when I went to America that I wasn't participating in that any longer. But here we see the kinds of schoolboys I went played with. This is my godmother's son who was at Eton, Alexander Shepherd, and he at least was a day boy and in ceramics, so he escaped the worst of it. And he came to visit me here in Italy. This is my passport photograph for going to France. And here I am on the beautiful Italian terrace of my school, built by Augustus Hare, the Victorian travel writer. Here's my schooling with Sister Jean in the science lab, which later, when I came back, would become my studio. Here is Sister Barbara, the very sarcastic Latin teacher. I had to overcome her sarcasm to get my PhD, where Latin was required amongst the other three languages. And here is the school, which was truly beautiful. The mother foundress had believed it was important to have children in a place of beauty, writing in her rule in the 19th century that a sin against beauty is a sin against the Holy Ghost. At the same time, she was a socialist. She began the school in Red Lion Square, William Morris's home, and the chapel had this wonderful Ghent altarpiece. And here she is. She had her nuns study to the level of priestly ordination in the 19th century with Greek and Hebrew, and her library was marvelous. I became its librarian of 20,000 books. In the garden, Augustus Hare had brought Queen Anne, the statue outside of St. Paul's Cathedral, paid for by all the European Protestant kings and queens. And then the trust, when we asked if we could restore it, said no, they would take care of it. And this is how they took care of it: all the statues decapitated, abandoned. I was really cross when I saw that. It's laissez majesté. And this was the window in the little chapel Mother Agnes had built out of the stable with the four angels. She was part of a circle of artists and writers, friends with Gerard Manley Hopkins and so forth. And here we have Raphael, Gabriel, Uriel, and Michael. And then I was able finally to bring my children back to England. And here we are in Wales in Conway Castle with Auntie Eileen, the artist, in her National Trust cottage on a Welsh trout stream. Here she is playing her Irish harp with Colin and Jonathan. And we also got to see Stonehenge. I had bought a Volkswagen station wagon and was able to drive all over Europe with it with my children. Then I came back to England finally, but first did the pilgrimage to Jerusalem. And here we are in the Holy Sepulchre. And I loved this diptych by Simone Martini, where you have the newborn child and then the dying dead Christ, both with red hair, playing with the name Adam, which means red earth, all men, all women, and in which, when you close it, death becomes life. And this was also, I painted it because it was so like my youngest son with his red hair. We both knew that he was not going to be living very long. And I went into the convent hoping that if I gave myself to God, he would save my son. Here I am with an Italian girl, but in Breed Church, and here again at Tese. And then my grandson came, Akita, and we went for a picnic at Bodiam Castle because he loved castles. And I had gone there on my birthday once as a child, and it was a beautiful place. And I was able in the convent to edit the manuscripts of Julian of Norwich, going to the British Library where three of them are, four actually, and also traveling to France to see manuscripts there in the Bibliothèque Nationale and Westminster Cathedral. And my father, as a boy, as an orphan, had worked in the Bodleian Library, and I was able also to go there and study manuscripts of Brunetto Latino and to give them eventually my edition of Julian von Norwich, as well as giving a paper in Cambridge, Corpus Christi College, where we went punting on the Thames with champagne. There I was, dressed as a nun, singing madrigals down the river. And here I am coming back to the school gathering, and that would probably be the last time I would be in England. Now, to go to the part stolen too, where I go to America at 16. Here I am on shipboard, journeying first to Connecticut to one aunt, and then to California to the other, my mother's sister, my father's sister. And my father's sister had had a mental breakdown in England, working in the slum schools in Birmingham. And the Quakers had arranged for her to teach at Mills College, where she was part of the child laboratory and where she could study also art. For instance, Frederick Taubes taught there, and also Max Beckmann. And he loved this painting she did of what it felt like to leave Europe on ship as a refugee from the war. She had come to America before the war, and I came to America to her after the war. And here I am with my aunt in California and also in Mexico. My aunt was constantly using me as her model for portraits, and she wanted me to study home economics and marry and have children. And I wanted instead to have read history at Oxford, which was not possible because I had to leave school at 16. So in America, history began with the Mayflower. At least literature began with Chaucer earlier. So here I was, editor of the Read magazine, And in the creative writing class, Harold Holloway had written a story about California, which gave me a sense of its pioneering history, with Irina Alice Holloway, his grandmother, Wirt Holloway, his grandfather. She had 12 children in the San Joaquin Valley Desert. So I saw that that story got published. I was 8 years younger than he. And here I am at our wedding, which would be my mother was to have sent me her wedding dress. Well, not her wedding dress, the dress she bought to wear tea at the House of Commons. A beautiful lace dress that cost £1,000, and my father had to pay for it out of a salary of £3,000. It never arrived. So instead, I made this simple wedding dress, and later on would line my children's clothes with its silk. And my aunt painted the scene of our wedding in her garden. And here is our first child, whom I called Robin, like my father's name. But my husband said, no, 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 that's a homosexual name because it's a girl's name. It has to be Richard. And here we are under the portrait of my grandmother and my father as a baby, with myself with our baby, 4 generations. And then the second child is Colin, born 3 years later, because my father said Richard needed a brother. And Colin was so beautiful. Here we are with the bird puzzle tree in the tiny garden we had. And then this photograph taken of them on the horse. And when I shared that with them, they said they remembered the smell of that horse and the trappings and so forth. And here's Richard, who was then studying at the Carey School. Eva Meyer was my friend and co-teacher. And I'm pregnant with Jonathan, and I'm showing her the silver christening cup I had brought in my suitcase that my grandfather had given me of Georgian silver. And this is the birth of Jonathan, whom I have laid on the bed with the tree of life. And we were then living in one bedroom apartment. And so I used my Irish diary I had never touched before, feeling that if I only used it to pay off Hal's debts, it would be lost. So I used it for the down payment for our house, which I loved. And here are all three of my sons under Irina Alice's quilt, and the tree house with Jonathan, Jonathan in his crib. I'm combing Jonathan's hair. He was a wonderful child. But I was raped for him to come into being because I promised my husband there would never be a third child or the marriage would end. So I was trying to keep the marriage from ending by buying the house and writing the book he told me I had to write. That's Mosaic, which is also part of the layers of this autobiography. Here is Uncle Dutch coming. He was an airman flying for TWA and also a friend of the Emperor Haile Selassie of Ethiopia. And Hal would write his doctoral dissertation on him, a rather narcissistic doctoral dissertation about someone, a relative with his own name. And here we all are ready for church. This is the puppet theatre with the family from whom we bought the house that their father had made the puppet theatre, with Brian and Cindy and Denise and Hal with Jonathan. And this is Richard going to school at Carey School and then at Barrett School. And later he will be at Cornell School in Berkeley, where he will be with black children and white children and Asian children in that wonderful open society we would come into. Then Hal really went off the rails very badly, and we had to flee. And here we are in a Theosophist camp up in the mountains. The children traumatized. We are in a meadow of flowers. Later on, from Berkeley, my aunt will take us to Asilomar by the sea. but we have very few holidays. This is Richard with his great friend Gordon. This is the three children as pilgrims with their pet rabbit because a rabbit doesn't make noise and we were not allowed pets in married student housing. And this is Colin's painting, which he had done at the house in Belmont, and I had explained to him that it was the middle painting and the middle child was the most important because he didn't speak until he was 4 years old. I was not allowed to speak to him because Hal said I would contaminate him with my European dirtiness. This was the sort of the American hatred of the immigrant. And here is Jonathan in Quincy playing chess with David Shannon, who is Jewish. Jonathan and David were great friends. And then at Princeton, this is the meeting house. This is Richard's photograph of Jonathan swinging. This is a painting I saw in the Villa Doria Pamphili in Rome, and it reminds me of Edward Hicks' Quaker painting of the Peaceable Kingdom, the first illustrating, as it were, Milton's Paradise Lost. And we became very staunch members of Quincy meeting and Princeton meeting, and I was also on the Peace Committee in Philadelphia. And my children were rather hippie. This is Richard visiting Colin with his teepee I had helped buy. This is Colin's first child. He had him when he was 17, with the boomerang that a professor at Princeton gave me for him because it was slightly marred. It had a chip off it. And Akita is with his Native American friend, Blonde Che. And this is the wedding of Colin with Mara. And in the land that I had helped buy, which they would then lose. And this is uh, Caroline and Tanya and Richard and Hal and his second wife, whom he married in synagogue. And also, this is Kathy, who is the mother of Jasmine. And here we all are at the wedding. The housewife was honking the horn of her car, deeply disapproving of us as being such hippies. But it was a beautiful wedding. And this is Jonathan, whom I helped arrive at the wedding with the bus fare. And here I am behind Mara wearing the hat I acquired in Florence. And these are Jasmine and Caroline. And this is me with that hat. And here's Hal beside the teepee, which I had helped buy. And then soon after, Richard married Tanya. And here we have myself and Akita coming to that wedding, and then me with Caroline and Richard with Robin, because Hal was very cross that Richard called his son Robin because that was forbidden. And I was really touched, but also scared because I knew how angry Hal could be about this. And then as a kind of golden parachute, when I left my teaching job to enter my convent, I put together this art show of a family of Anglo Irish artists, and the Irish musicians came and they played the music of Wild Geese, and that was the title, Wild Geese, a family of Anglo Irish artists. And so we had John Nunbolt and Richard Rothwell, who was an Anglo-Irish artist working in Rome, after whom my brother was named, and Auntie Eileen and Auntie Joyce, and also even myself, because I had always wanted to be like the rest of my family, an artist. And here we have Jonathan with his because we were starving at Berkeley when I was in graduate school. And he has this school bus, No More Hungry Children. And he runs this wonderful Everybody's Kitchen in Philadelphia, in New York, and in Washington, D.C. and I was with him in the one in Washington, D.C. And here he is with Aurora and Flower. And here I am with the peace ribbon I embroidered of a scene from the Bayeux tapestry, where the woman is fleeing from the Normans with her child, who are burning down her house, as hell almost burned down our house. And this is baby Jasmine, Jasmine and Aurora and Jasmine, all Jonathan's children. And here is Jonathan with his very badly broken leg, um, shortly before he died, with his children. And then with the orphans, I made their dresses. And Aurora has put this tattoo on her ankle. And then the wedding of Caroline. Colin arrives as Ferrell Holloway, showing off his camera to his brother Richard. They both loved photography. And here we all are, and with Aurora, Jasmine, and Asha. And here is Caroline with her bridesmaids, and Robin, her brother. And this is Colin with his daughter Rowan at George School, the Quaker school, that he had so much wanted to go to, and there was no way that I could afford it. And here is Akita's wedding at White Sands, and also Colin in New Mexico in the cold. And then I love this picture because I also was a Christ child at my first Christmas at Powdermill in England. And this is Rose with her brother Luke, the children of Caroline, playing the Nativity at their school, their Catholic school. Now, stolen three. This is where my father and his lover Amato and Richard are feeding the pigeons at San Marco. Richard is 18 months old, who speaks Italian before he speaks English. And my father gave us this honeymoon at Amalfi because Hal hadn't given me a honeymoon. I was working in a nursery school, he was working in a cannery, and he would never come home in the evenings, and I would wait hours upon hours upon hours. So my father gave us this honeymoon already with the baby, and it was a lovely place. And I swam around this headland to the cave behind it. And also, I can remember my husband kicked me out of the marriage bed. I kept the baby with him, and I had to sleep on the marble floor, some honeymoon. But I was sketching the Michelangelo Pietà in the Duomo, where it then was during the sermon preached against um, the Dolce Vita film. And you know that Michelangelo gives his self portrait as Joseph of Arimathea as a misericordia worker. These were the porters carrying the sick and the dying and the dead. And this in Murano on the lagoon in Venice, it's beautiful mosaic. I kept copying just the way I keep copying the motif and the fresco the Cardinal Bessarione's house. And this is Paestum that Hal and I visited. Hal was very angry with me that day, but I can remember the beauty of that place and fascination. And when we were in Venice, Hal went to Venice alone, and I was to fly. Well, my father took me on the Sette Bello instead of flying, which is an expensive train journey. It was gorgeous. But Richard went into a beam of sunlight in San Marco, and this elderly lady gave him the Nicopea, the little prayer card. And later, when I would be consecrated in Florence in the Comunità dei Figli di Dio, that would be the icon that would be given to me. This wonderful coincidence of which is God's poetry, I think. And this wonderful statue at Tivoli. That time I was staying in Italy was my women's grand tour where I was just absorbing all of Italian European culture, for from which I was, in a sense, deprived, though studying in America. And here's my father writing in this red walled room. My brother came from Canada to live with him and married Maria Antonia Bandrez, who was the head of the translators at FAO in Rome. And here I bring all three of my children to Rome: Richard, Colin, and Jonathan. And we are in the forum. That photograph is now very faded, but once that sky was so blue, and I had made their clothes, lining it with my wedding dress silk. And here we are at Caserta, on the modern bridge replacing the Roman one, which the German commanding officer and the bishop had blown up to convince the headquarters that they had killed everyone in the town of Caserta, when they hadn't. And they used this as a symbol because it was very famous for the German tourists. And here we are on the boat going to Sardinia, and in Sardinia. And this is when I came back to Rome for my father's funeral. And then we traveled up to Switzerland to be with a cousin, Pauline, in the house that her architect husband had built. He was Swiss, and they had been in Hungary, in Zurich. And then I had a sabbatical in Italy and was actually living in Elizabeth Barrett Browning's Casa Guidi. And here I am giving a talk on her and the slavery background of the Barrett family, which rather shocked then the Texan audience who had come from Baylor University. They have since become less racist, but at that point, it was still with the before civil rights and with the white only signs on benches and drinking fountains and store entrances. And this is me with my brother at Las Huelgas and Burgos in Spain. And then I am a part of the Comunità dei Figli di Dio. We are in Melbourne, Australia. Here I am with the Contessa Barbara Amo and Francoise Chiarini in a group, a prayer group we had. And also my student, Philip Roughton, has me come to Iceland. I was given a million lira to have my transcription of Brunetto Latino's Tesoretto published by Le Lettere. And I used the money to go to Iceland. I'd always wanted to visit. And Phil had me give 4 lectures there. And here I am with Jonas Christiansen, the great Icelandic scholar. And he's the one who told me about the first American European in America, Guthritha, who gives birth to a child in Newfoundland. And here I am in our library when the Swiss allowed me to have the English cemetery. And this is a photograph taken by one of my granddaughters. And then Richard came to visit and photographed, and I showed them the display case I had done on Brunetto Latino in the Museo Casa di Dante. It's now taken down, no longer exists. And this is my granddaughter Aurora, named after Aurora Lee, Elizabeth Barrett Browning's epic novel. And this is my son taking the photograph of our upstairs library with Greek, Latin, and Italian, especially Dante. And downstairs with the cradle, uh, Eloise had said to Abelard, "You can't have cradles in libraries." Well, I disobey that. And it's wonderful to have a cradle in a library with a Roma baby in it. And the painting by a Norwegian artist, I showed him how to gold leaf, how to stretch canvas and how to frame. And this photograph by Karen Graffio with a Roma baby in a cradle. You can't have cradles in libraries. Well, you certainly can. And again, this library, which is my pride and joy, a library in a garden. And here I am having Luke ring the bell. And this is what we do when there is a funeral with a child. We have them give them the control of ringing the bell, something that they will never forget. And here is Luke on the carousel in the Piazza della Repubblica. And here we are in a Florentine street in a horse drawn carriage, a wonderful luxury I normally never could afford, but certainly will splurge with my own family. And here is Luke feeding the pigeons just the way his father had fed the pigeons many years before in San Marco. And this is Caroline's drawing of Richard when he had died in the hospice of cancer. This is my library, and again, my library with the books I have written. Again, the edition of Julian of Norwich, which had me enter my convent to edit those manuscripts. And these are the books that I have been able to write. In a sense, they're my trauma therapy. When I am buried in a book, as the Attica State prisoners said, I'm not here, I'm in a better place. Books about Brunetta Latino, about pilgrimage, about women, about Brunetto again, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, pilgrimage, Apuleius, whom I love, the two great African writers who influenced so much European literature are Terence and Apuleius. And we forget that. We've censored it. We whitewash European culture when it is based on Mediterranean and African culture. And again, Julian of Norwich, Umilta, who was a nun here in Florence from Vicenza, more books on Julian, on Dante, on Elizabeth Barrett Browning, on Christine de Pizan, and also the edition of the anti slavery novel by Francis Trollope of Jonathan Jefferson Whitlaw, which I did with the Trollope Society. And then these two books are just about to be published, one by the Regione, the edition of Brunetto Latino's Tesoro, Tesoretto, Retorica, texts he was teaching to Dante, and then O Bella Libertà, all of Elizabeth Barrett Browning's major poetry, translated really for the first time with Rita Severi and a whole group of women and a few men into Italian. With the cover being Aurora, I said for the penguin, that was non negotiable, and also the Italian bandiera of red, white, and green, which Elizabeth Barrett Browning used for her Casa Guidi house. And then the beautiful Laurentian Library, where many of the Brunetto Latino manuscripts are, but some are also in the Biblioteca Nazionale. And as you go up the stairs, there is the librarian Magliabecchi, who looks as though he's got terrible toothache. And I always smile when I pass that marble sculpture. And here I am gardening in the cemetery. The Gonfalone of Justice was brought to us twice. And then Daniel Claudio Dumitrescu, who was our Roma restorer, was invited also to help restore Donatello's pulpit in Prato. And here is the Bishop of Prato showing the relic of the cord that the Virgin gave in the story to Thomas, doubting Thomas. When the COVID epidemic started in the night, there was this radio television broadcast of the bishop in the dark, in the silence of the square, bringing out this relic to protect Prato. And these are the Roma, the Van Gogh painting of their caravans, the sense. in my theology now is no longer the pseudo-Dionysian hierarchy. Instead, it is vertical. Every person is a holy place. This was Jonathan's T-shirt that he wore into tatters from a Quaker annual general meeting. And I love this Fra Angelico painting, which is not in Florence, it's in Rome. The Medici would not have approved of it, of San Lorenzo giving alms to the poor, the beggars. And when the barbarians came to Rome, he presented the beggars to the barbarians who were clamoring for treasure, saying, "These are our treasure." And this is what I found with the Roma. And our work, restoring the English cemetery, actually won for us the medallion of Nicholas Denone, who was the great scholar, Protestant, who became Catholic, who was the medical, wonderful dispenser of charity in Florence. And this is one of the babies we rescued from the hospital and from the tribunal. He was about to be put up for adoption. We got him back for his parents, and they sent me this photograph from Romania. There he is, this happy, beautiful, clean child. If he'd been brought up by social assistance, that would not have been the case. And we are now finding two children are in social assistance's care, dirty, unhappy, not wanting to go on living. You don't put children in institutions. They need their families, they need affection, they need love, even if it's a family in poverty, even in extreme poverty. This is a photograph that Daniel took of Thomas Southwood Smith, who was saying what you need in the houses of the poor is fresh air and sunlight against diseases like TB. He was saying that in the 19th century is just as true in the 21st. This is Daniel and Vandana. They are building the cradle for their baby, which will be born the next day. And he is absolutely splendid, but now has fallen from a roof and is paralyzed. And I'm struggling to help his family, who have no other support than him and myself. And then these two children begging in the street, Ferdinando, Esmeralda, at least they got some schooling. She came to my computer where I was typing out Brunetta Latino's translation into Italian from Aristotle's Ethics on Justice, and she read the page perfectly in her third language at 10 years old. They were so poor that the Comune sent them away, and they went first to France and then to Spain, where I hope they're being treated better. And I hope that Esmeralda will somehow manage to keep her schooling. She's wonderful. And this is her mother, Zoita, looking at a children's book of Dante, saying, "Che bello." And we also learned that all of our Roma had relatives who died in Transnistria. For centuries, the Roma were the slaves in Romania of the nobles and the monasteries. And then they were freed with the publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin. The slavery had begun earlier than the discovery of America in the Middle Ages. And then, following that, no civil rights and Transnistria, where they were deported and left to die in open fields without a grave, without a coffin, without a funeral, without a priest, without the bread, the wine, the banquet. So we did the banquet, the bread and the wine, the priest saying all of the names and then blessing the tombs of the Romanian nobles who owned slaves that we have in our cemetery. Cantacuzene, who's descended from the Emperor of Constantinople, and so forth. This is Daniel's family and his four daughters who came to live with us. They were wonderful, so clean, so courteous, so sweet, so intelligent. And then these are the four children of Diamanta and Yonel, taken from them wrongfully 7 years ago. We've won the Supreme Court case, but the local tribunal still wants to keep them. These two are legally adopted. These two are in care and are not being cared for very well at all. And Daniel had chiseled this plaque for the visit of Frederick Douglass, 11th of May, 1887. Daniel, recall, is himself descended from slaves. And then this is Diamanta, the mother of the four children, looking very pre Raphaelite as she harvests the dead irises in the cemetery. And I also not only work with Roma, part of the library is on all of the minority groups subjected to poverty, Aborigine, Native American, blacks, Jews, women, and so forth. And we recall that Helena was the slave who became pregnant with Constance's son, Constantine. He repudiates her, but Constantine, when he becomes emperor, creates her empress. And I did this icon, and it's really myself and my son Richard, whom I'm seeking to protect from his father. And then this is the edition of Christine de Pizan. Here I am lecturing on the women in the English cemetery, like Frances Trollope and Elizabeth Browning, in my own University of California, Berkeley's program in Florence. And above is a slide of Madame de Stael as Corinne ou Italy, a book which all of these women loved and was their role model. And then one day, Lisa Dwan showed up at the cemetery and said, I am a Beckett actress. And I said, oh, I'm related to Beckett because my great grandfather married Pauline Beckett, who was Samuel's aunt. And so she was doing Nose Knife in Abbey Theatre in Dublin, and I flew to see her performance. And here I am on my bicycle. I'm no longer permitted my bicycle because I've fallen and broken my arm. But I loved cycling around Florence, no longer owning a car, no longer owning a house or having really my family, my professorship, having given all of those up. Now I've even had to give up my bicycle. Um, and then we had this terrible storm, a supercell, which destroyed the tomb of Theodore Parker, visited by Frederick Douglass. So Daniel got it perfectly restored. And now we have COVID, which is like the 1917 flu epidemic. So we've had disaster after disaster. But what I have always found very therapeutic is repairing and cataloging and typesetting and printing and binding books. And also the Cardinal Bessarione design, which I use on the ceiling of my libraries, and also we marble paper. Here, Daniel and I have worked on making the facsimile of Dante's Libro del Chiodo, where he's exiled and condemned to death 3 times. Daniel did the metal, and my bookbinding professor, guru Enrico Giannini, did the leather. And here is Elizabeth Barrett Browning's tomb with the lilies and the roses, and our edition of her sonnets from the Portuguese and her anti slavery poetry with the text in both English and Italian, set in William Morris type. And here more scenes of the cemetery, which is beautiful. It was abandoned, filled with syringes, black masses, suicide attempts, vandalism. But when the Roma started the gardening and planting the irises, all the evil went away. And I also make my own clothes. And then these are what I hope when they bury me here, they will cremate with me. This is what I had begun writing in Belmont and then tore it up, the beginning of the autobiography, patchwork quilt. Colin is struggling to get into his overalls. His foot goes through one sleeve hole. He is proud of this. Get dressed and go out. Richard puts on socks, shoes, and shirt. Scattering and laughing, they run through the house. The doors slam, and they are gone. Out in the oak trees, the wind and the hill. Jonathan begins to cry. He is fed spoonful by spoonful, dip, shovel, wipe, dip, shovel. He laughs too in his playpen. He teases on his toys. The kitten cries for milk. And it's very difficult, as my friend Juliana Dresviner knows, with babies, to also be a scholar. So this piece of writing only got that far, but I used it to wrap up the pieces of Jonathan's hair when he was a baby, and also from his corpse, and kept it in this little wooden box. And then this is my first son. He was my third. My first son made this model of a steeple, which he actually did build the full size for a church. And I had bought this cross in New Mexico made by the Penitente with the image of El Nino, the child, the Christ child, who is the pilgrim, who is lost without his mother. In Spain, he is shown with his mother, she also the pilgrim. But in the New World, the old country, the mother is left behind. So those become the symbols of my two lost children. I was not allowed to have their ashes, but at least I can have some emblems of them with me at the end. Uh, Now, I think we can close this and terminate the discussion. And let's see if I can find where. Okay. And thank you for listening and play with all of the levels of this text with Mosaic and with the free versions of Stolen as well as this.